All right. How's everyone doing today? Really? We're in Vegas, people. How's everyone doing today? Yeah, that's what I like to hear. I am so excited to be speaking with you today. I think it's been almost a year and a half before I've been on the stage, and I'm super excited to be speaking to, doing a presentation live. I've been doing it on Zoom for about a year or so, and I'm just truly happy to see all these beautiful faces in the crowd, and I'm so excited to be speaking to you today about CloudFormation, infrastructure as code. Matter of fact, if you guys don't mind, I'm actually going to take a picture of all your beautiful faces because I want to remember this and put it on my social media. So, welcome to my presentation. I know it's late on a Monday, it's 5:30, and I'm super excited that you actually came to see my presentation about infrastructure as code. So, my name is Brian Terry, and I'm a developer advocate on the CloudFormation team. And today, we're going to be talking about how to reuse patterns when developing infrastructure as code. So, how many people here use CloudFormation? Raise your hand. I'm super excited. Yes. So, out of the people that use CloudFormation, do you consider yourself a software developer? Well, I say if you're developing CloudFormation and you're building infrastructure as code, you are a software developer. And it goes back to a quote that every good software developer should know, and I think every good software developer or CloudFormation developer should know, and it's that good programmers know what to write, and great ones know what to rewrite and reuse. So when you're a software developer, you don't recreate the wheel all the time. And I assume when you're creating CloudFormation infrastructure as code, you're not reinventing the wheel. You're borrowing different libraries or using old templates or something like that. So that's what we're going to talk about today, different patterns in which you can reuse things within your infrastructure as code development cycle. So is everyone with me? I need a woo. I don't have to keep going. Come on, guys. So let's talk a little bit about the agenda. First, I'll talk a little bit about myself, tell you why I'm up here on the stage qualified to actually give this talk. Next, we'll talk about some challenges with developing and deploying infrastructure as code. Next, we'll talk about some options from AWS, some really cool ones, some that I really like. And I'm just not saying that because I work for CloudFormation. I actually really love some of these tools. And then next, we're going to talk about how to level up your reuse patterns. So, a little bit about myself. I've been with AWS for a little over 3.5 years, and before that, I cut my teeth on AWS at a startup. And before that, I did some other things, like I was a software developer. I even worked at a private school as a technology director, so I've been around technology over the last 20 years in a lot of different roles. And, I would say that having those different roles gave me the ability to see a lot of aspects about technology. So, you may ask yourself, well, how did he get started with CloudFormation? How is he can give this talk about infrastructure as code? Well, I learned CloudFormation from one simple request. So, as a DevOps engineer at a startup, I had just started that job. And at that point in my life, I thought I had seen everything in technology. I felt that I was qualified no matter what people gave me. So, my very first day on my new DevOps job, mind you, I was just my first day as a DevOps engineer, I was excited about it. I thought I was really qualified. My manager calls down to my desk and he said, Brian, I want you to create a VPN solution in CloudFormation across multiple availability zones. I want you to create it in CloudFormation, and I want to be able to deploy it in different accounts in different regions. And I said, absolutely, sir, I can do that. I just have 2 questions for you, just 2, and I can get this project done for you. Number 1, what is AWS? Number 2, what is CloudFormation? So, I'm lucky to say that he didn't fire me on the spot. He just kind of hung up on me. So I spent about a week creating this infrastructure for him. I spent a week diving into CloudFormation docs, trying to understand CloudFormation. I spent hours under my desk trying to get this project done because I felt like he would fire me because I didn't know what I was doing. So I got this project done, and at the end of the day, I was happy for it because that's when I really learned CloudFormation. That's when I really learned to really love CloudFormation, having to struggle in order to create this template. But that isn't a typical learning pattern, and that, when I look back on it, I don't really think that was really productive, right? So, CloudFormation, the service that I love, the service that got me started with AWS, the service that actually got me standing on this stage. So, just to recap, let's talk a little bit about CloudFormation. I know there were a lot of raised hands in the audience that you guys have used CloudFormation before and developed CloudFormation. That's okay. We're just going to set a baseline. So let's just talk about how CloudFormation works. So basically, CloudFormation, you create your infrastructure in YAML or JSON. You create these in templates. You upload these to S3. Then you create a stack, and then you manage these stacks. Simple enough. I'm sure you guys have done this a million times, right? And I'm sure, being the professionals you are, you've probably got an email like this. You know, something urgent to create, some urgent structure. So for this talk, I've always wondered what it would be like if I could go back to that role with the knowledge that I have right now as a DevOps engineer and with experience with CloudFormation and knowing a little bit about these features. What would that week or that day or that month look like? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to relive my life. You guys are going to help me. And I am going to work in this DevOps industry, this startup again, and I'm going to show you how I would have done it back then. So is everyone with me? I need a woo. All right. So let's assume that I get this request in by email. It says, Brian, hey Brian, this is Sam from R&D. We need to deploy a pipeline with our new service. Can you create and deploy this by the end of the week? It's always a rush, right? We have to always be in a rush. And I'm going to say yes. So let's assume that I spent, I don't know, a few days, a few weeks looking at CloudFormation documentation, and I come up with this simple architecture. Very simple enough. It's a Git repository. They push to it a Lambda function, does some lifting for us in order to create this pipeline for them to deploy to an S3 bucket. So just a simple architecture. And as you can see, it includes, what, a couple services or so. So that's what we're going to create. So with that said, let's jump into the first demo. So cue the demo. They told me to give them a cue, and that's it. So, so as you can see, let's assume that I've spent a few hours developing this infrastructure. I've created this CloudFormation template, and let's zoom out on this bad boy just a little bit. And let's assume that I've spent a lot of time flushing this out, got this infrastructure ready, and it's 200 lines of code. Wow. So it's a complete CloudFormation template, and it's flushed out, it's ready to go. I've got my template, and then I go into my AWS account, and I launch this template. And I'm not going to make you guys watch till the whole stack creates, so we'll just assume that I launched the stack, it came up, it's great. But as you can see, it created a ton of resources, everything's ready to go, they have the pipeline, so we are ready to go with our infrastructure. So you can assume that I spent some time doing that. I deployed it for this one request, and now I'm done. I've done my job. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, simple enough, right? So let's think about some of the challenges with doing that. So with the challenges of building infrastructure like that and you get these ad hoc demands, there's a couple challenges. Like, we as builders spend too much time trying to figure out what are the resources, what are the dependencies of resources, what are the best practices for deploying these resources. Another challenge with that is applications often share architectural elements, right? You may want to borrow from one template to another template so you don't have to reinvent the wheel just so you can get your job done. Next, model infrastructure becomes repetitive, right? You're constantly reinventing the wheel. There are times when you have to do this, but you have to reuse a lot of the same different tools. For example, you have a Lambda function with a read and write to a DynamoDB, something like that, right? You may reuse that within a template over and over again just to cope with these ad hoc requests or build this infrastructure within your organization. And finally, it just takes valuable time for you to build these unique features into the template when you have to. So what if that example was he wanted to create 2 pipelines? Well, what do? I create 2 CloudFormation templates. Do I spend the time combining the templates? Do I create a template with stacks in it? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do this, right? So at AWS, they've thought about this. There are some smart guys that work in AWS, smarter than me, definitely. So they've come up with a couple of different solutions to kind of help you with this problem. So in this presentation, we're actually going to look at 2 of them. We're going to look at CloudFormation modules and AWS AWS CDK, which is the Cloud Development Kit. So we're going to look at 2 of those products from AWS. Specifically, we're going to look at both ways to do this. We're going to actually look at both ways to combine both these products to create some reusable assets within your organization. So the first thing we're going to talk about, CloudFormation modules. Everyone with me? Okay. So CloudFormation modules is a new feature in CloudFormation. I actually really like modules. So this may be your question. What are modules? And why should I use them? I hope you're very excited about seeing my next slide. So modules allow you to encapsulate common software solutions or architecture solutions, and then they can be optimized for best practices. You can reuse these across your organization. So you can consider you build this infrastructure, say if you spend a lot of time building it. You can create a module for that and reuse it within templates over and over within your organization. So let's quickly take a look at an example of what a module looks like. So as you saw in my first example, I created that infrastructure. It was like 200 lines of code or whatever. So as you can see in this example, it's a multi-line code just for this very simple piece of infrastructure, right? What do we have in here? We have just an S3 bucket. That's about it. But it's multiple lines of code. So let's see what a module looks like if you were to take this infrastructure and convert it into a module. Well, it cuts down to just one resource. But it actually looks like one resource, right? Except it has a very special name, right? Let's take a look at that. So it has a very special name with module at the end. So how cool is this? You can reuse all this infrastructure code in another CloudFormation template by simply modeling as one resource. What's that? So let's dig a little deeper into these modules. So in these modules, they're using the resource section of the template, and they're differentiated by having that 4th section type called module. So as again, you can see in this example, it's our resource, : module, right? So let's take a look at what's called a schema. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about this, but we actually see an example when we actually look at how to create a module. So at a high level, a CloudFormation schema is the modeling of a resource. So CloudFormation released a way in which you can create your own resource providers called resource types, public and private. Well, they also did this with modules. So basically what the CLI does, and a lot of our tooling does for you, is actually take that CloudFormation template and convert it to a schema. And then that schema is used to validate inputs into your template. It's also used to deploy your template. At a high level, you really don't have to understand what the schema is. What you just need to understand is the CLI takes care of it for you when you do modules. So it's really simple. So let's talk about the module platform. So this is what it looks like at a super high level. So basically, we have this thing called a CloudFormation registry. And as you can see, it's at the center. And this is because a lot of different types of personas can use it. So basically, at the registry, it's a place where you can have these resource types. You can have these modules, these best practices you can use over and over again within your organization. And these resources or these things can be created by AWS services, so like the DynamoDB team may create a module or something or a resource type. There are also internal experts may create these modules. There's also the community at large can publish these things to the registry. And on the other side of that, you have these consumers, right? They can use these things within their templates. Developers, people that have years of experience developing CloudFormation can use these things. People that have no experience with using CloudFormation can use these things by using like this one module and a couple lines of code. So it makes it really easy to people to start using these very complex infrastructure patterns without having to do all that within their code. And the coolest thing about the registry is you can publish things to these registries. You can publish things to the public registry. You can publish things to the private registry. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So, who does this benefit? Who does this benefit by creating these reusable patterns and sharing them across your organization? Well, it benefits everyone, right? Let's talk about how it benefits everyone, right? It benefits the publisher because it can encapsulate, share these best practices across the organization, and they can distribute updates with them with native version management within the modules, right? You can version these things. How cool is that, right? And on the other side of that, the consumers, right? They can effortlessly just adhere to best practices out of the gate. So if you have a team of software developers, right, and you want to hand them the keys to allow them to create CloudFormation templates, well, you can tell them they can use these modules. You can publish these modules specifically for them. It abstracts away the resource insides of the resource. Basically, these things become like a black box of these infrastructures you can reuse over and over again, right? They don't have to understand what's inside the box. They can just use it. Then they can leverage these reusable templates of code and reduce development time. And then you can build your infrastructure and applications in modular components. So I touched on this a little bit, but we do have the public registry and the private registry. So the private registry contains modules only available in your account. So if you think about you want to create these modules that are specific to your organization and you want to hide maybe some things within it, right? You can create a private module, or you can use the private registry. Now, on the side of it is the public registry, and this is where it gets cool. So if you come up with a great infrastructure that you want to share with the world, you can just publish it into the public registry. And what's cool about this is we even have partners that have published to this, right? So if we go into the CloudFormation console and take a look, we'll see companies such as Datadog, MongoDB have created modules and resources. How cool is that? And over time, the vision is that there are going to be a bunch of different resources within this registry that you're going to be able to use out of the box. You're not going to have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to create one of these pieces of infrastructure. You just use it right out of the module. How cool is that? Out of the marketplace. How cool is that? So think about it. If there was a VPN solution in that, and then on my very first day as an employee at this startup, I could have just reused the module. And I could have been done in an hour. I could have been a hero. He probably would have promoted me, and he would have just cheered and carried me down the hall. That's what I think about in my mind, at least. So the CloudFormation registry. So like I said again, this registry contains a lot of cool things in it that you can reuse over and over again, right? So these modules are a CloudFormation registry. They have an extension type, just like a resource. Modules are listed in the console, and we'll get a little bit of this when I do the demo. And you can click on modules, and you can see the underlying infrastructure of the module. You may not be able to edit it, but you can see what makes up a module. You can see that maybe you can change the EC2 instance, load balancer, et cetera. But you'll be able to see what's in it, and you can understand what this module is trying to deploy. So some things to note about modules. Modules, they have input parameters, just like a template, right? You have your input parameters. Modules also have an output parameters. But again, you can use the ref resource inside the module to get specific things within the infrastructure of that module. We'll take a look at that. You can also use the get at to get at attributes inside the module. And the resources and properties can't be modified in the module. So this is important. So if there's a module that deploys 3 EC2 instances, and it doesn't have a property that defines what the instance count is, you can't like say, I just want to remove an EC2 instance or 2. You have to use a module completely, right? So again, it's a black box. You can control the input parameters, the output parameters, And that's how you can kind of really think of it. All right, is everyone with me? Oh, come on, guys. All right. So got another request in my inbox. This time, this is from James. He's from the front-end team. They need to deploy a pipeline for the Angular app, and they need to host this app in S3, and it needs to be ready in 2 days. So I'm so good at my job, they were asking me to create an infrastructure, not in 2 weeks anymore. It's going to 2 days. So let's get it done. So let's assume that I've already created that template for the other team, and I'm going to reuse that. So we have our template, we have our pipeline, and then we take this pipeline, and then we're going to say, hey, we're going to add bolt onto this, right? So we're going to create his whole infrastructure by bolting on both of these. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to leverage modules for this. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take that template that we had before, and we're going to create a module out of it, and then we're going to upload that to the registry. Next, we're going to create a module based on this new infrastructure, because we're going to spend a lot of time creating this. We reuse it over and over again as a module. Then we're going to take this and we're going to put it into a CloudFormation template, and we're going to leverage these modules to deploy this infrastructure. So as you can see, when the modules are created in the CloudFormation backend, it'll break out all these other resources without us having to do all that heavy lifting and heavy work. So, demo time. All right, so let's jump into demo. All right, demo. They're working it. They're switching over for us. All right, so CloudFormation modules. Let's zoom in on this a little bit and take a look. So I've got a folder here. Demo 2. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 modules. I've created 2 folders for these, and we'll take a quick look at these or zoom in. I've created a app module folder and a pipeline module folder. So I'm going to CD into the app folder. Okay, so what I've done so far, pre-done on my computer, is I've installed the CloudFormation CLI. So basically, I went to the GitHub repository, I've installed the CloudFormation CLI, and basically, it's a tool that allows you to create resource types and modules. So basically, it builds out all the scaffolding for these projects. So I've go ahead and install that, and I can check to see if it's installed by running cfn, and you can see that cfn is installed. So let's create a module. So as you can see, there's nothing in this folder except a log for doing that. So what we're going to do is run cfn init, right? And then when we run cfn init, it asks us a couple questions about the infrastructure that we want to create. Specifically, it's asking us if we want to create a resource or if we want to create a module. So in this example, we're going to be creating a module. All right, the next question is going to ask us, what do we name my module, right? What organization, service, name, and you have to add module at the end, so that's very important. So for this very first one, we're going to, I've got names here. We're going to name the first one, Spacely App Module Prod. So this is where we're going to name our module, right? So as you can see, it initialized the module. It created a project for us. And if we look at this project, it gave us a number of files, right? It gives a fragment folder, and we'll take a look at that fragment folder in just a second. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go into our pipeline folder, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do cfn init. We're going to create a module, and we're going to give it this name, which is Spacely Sprocket Pipeline Module, right? So now we have initialized our project, and we have 2 projects for modules. So if we go to our IDE, let's take a look at that real quick. And the first one we'll look at is the app one. And as you can see, when you generate your project, you get a couple of files in there. You get a fragment folder, you get an RPDK config. So basically, you get a project to create a module. And I'm going to show you how simple it is to create a module. Well, the only thing you have to do is they provide the sample CloudFormation template. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that sample template, right? And we're going to use the fragment that we had for our app. So we'll take this 212 lines of code, and we'll actually go to our fragments folder, and we can actually just paste it there, inside there. So we'll take that. Oh, sorry about that. So see, cut and paste, let me down again. All right, so there we go. So it's the only thing that we have to do in order to initialize kind of the module or creating the module. You didn't have to do anything with the schema or anything like that, right? So only thing we have to do is within our app is run the CFN generate command. And what that does is that takes that CloudFormation template and it converts it to a schema. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so we got a fragment folder. Okay, so that's the only thing that we have to do that. And as you see, it verifies a little things. It runs lint up under the hood and some other things. But as you can see, it generated just fine to have our Spacely Sprocket app module. So in order to deploy this infrastructure or to add it to the registry, the only thing we have to do is run one simple command, cfn submit. And at this point, what this is doing is this is submitting it to the CloudFormation registry. It's doing a little checking, and then after a while, it'll submit it to the registry. So I'm not going to make you wait on that, but we'll go ahead and jump over in the console because I've also gone ahead and registered these resources. So as you can see, this is what the CloudFormation registry looks like. And as you can see within the registry, you'll see a number of resources, public ones that AWS publishes. But then you will also see this link here that says privately registered. So when our module registers, it will actually show up here as one of our active extensions. Oh, I am so sorry. Thank you. I owe you something for that. So here are the modules. So as you can see, assume that the submit finished and we submitted it. And as you can see, it is actually complete and we have new versions of it. So we have our modules here. So what's cool thing about these modules is we can actually double click on them. We can actually see the schema that was created for them. We can also see the resources that are within this module. So we've submitted it to the registry, and it's ready to use. And what's cool about it, they even also provide a template for you, right? So let's assume that we've got our app module, and I've also done the same thing, and I've created my pipeline module, and we'll quickly take a look at that. So I've got my infrastructure here. Again, this is a multi-line CloudFormation template that has been reduced down to this example template here, which is fairly simple and easy to use. So how can we use this? Well, let's go back to our example and take a look at that. So now that we've got our projects, we've created our pipelines, we've created our modules. Now the only thing we have to do is create a stack to deploy our wonderful infrastructure, and it looks like this. How cool is that? Right, we reduced thousands of lines of code into 2 resources, right? We've created an app module resource. We've created a pipeline resource, and we're even leveraging some of the output out of one module to the other. And we can reuse this over and over again, right? Not just this one template, any template you use. So if you really wanted to, if you wanted to create multiple pipelines with this, we can just do something like this, in which we just duplicate the code, and we call this pipeline 1 or pipeline 2, and we can create multiple pipelines, right? So how cool is that? So we've reduced thousands of lines of code into that. So if we were to go ahead and deploy that pipeline or that infrastructure into our CloudFormation, it takes a little bit of time to deploy, so I've go ahead and done that for you. As you can see, what happens is, up under the hood is, CloudFormation breaks out all these resources and deploys them for you. You didn't have to know what was in those modules, but CloudFormation deployed those for you, right? It even told you what module it was in. How cool is that? It even told you what specific module it came from. And again, you can reuse this over and over and over again. And if you're familiar with our offering called Config, which tracks resources over time in AWS, you can enable this, and modules are treated just like a simple resource within Config. So you can actually write prescriptive things around these things. So if we take a look at these, right, we'll see all these AWS resource types, right? But at the end, we're seeing our modules here, right? Our modules can be used in Config. How cool is that? And not only that, the resources that are broken out are visible in Config too. So you have that compliance layer on top of that. So that's, the other cool thing I wanted to show you about the public registry. So I spoke a little bit about you creating your own resources and publish them to the registry. If we go here, you'll see that there are tons of third-party resources here. There are modules, including companies such as JFrog. So you can deploy Artifactor if you wanted to with just a simple module. And you can even double-click on some of these modules and actually see what resources are contained in these modules. And you can see it's a number of them, right? And you can just reuse this as one simple resource, just like this template. So how cool is that? But now we're actually going to take it a step further. So let's go back to the slides real quick. So now that we've talked about modules and CloudFormation modules, we looked at the registry, we've seen how to create modules, we touched on that a little bit. Now let's talk about the AWS CDK. Well, AWS CDK is really cool. It is a multi-language software development framework for modeling cloud infrastructure as reusable components. So let's break that down, because that's a lot to say. So multi-language software. So CDK is available in TypeScript, JavaScript, Java, .NET, Python, and Go, which I love. I'm a gopher, so I really enjoy that part of it. So, and then they keep all these code bases in sync. So no matter what language you use, you can get a consistent interface with using the CDK. So multi-language development framework. And then for modeling your infrastructure, the term modeling is very important with the CDK, because remember, we're working with infrastructure. So with the CDK, we aren't writing code. We're creating infrastructure the way that we intend it to be deployed. And that's pretty important. And that's what we're doing with the CDK. We're modeling our infrastructure. We're creating how it should be deployed, and the CDK does that heavy lifting for you. And then next, it's reusable components. And that's just really its great strength, right? So you really use these components within your other CDK projects, just like software development libraries. It becomes reusable over and over again, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over again. So CDK has something cool called the construct library. And they have a lot of things called modules that have recently gone into GA, which is cool things around Kinesis, RDS, AWS CloudTrail, et cetera. And they also have some development preview modules also. So again, these are like reusable components, just like we saw with CloudFormation modules, except you can use these within the CDK construct library. So let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem around the CloudFormation CDK. So first, you have the construct library, right? So these constructs are provided by the AWS CDK team. They encapsulate some of the best practices and recommended architectures for deploying some things, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel again. You can just reuse these out of the box with the CDK. But then there's also the AWS solution construct, right? So you can actually use these constructs within your project too, and these are vetted, configurable, higher level infrastructure as code, parameters provided by AWS solution architecture team. So as you can see, you can get these components from different places and leverage a lot of different solutions within your project. Then we also have this CDK patterns site. So it's a catalog of higher level constructs provided by the CDK community and members. We thank our members for doing this because it's really great that people are willing to create this infrastructure and share it with the world. It's really awesome when you think about it. And then we also have the awesome CDK. It's a central awesomeness list for CDK open source projects. I myself love open source. I consider it to be a great thing for humanity in general to have open source projects because I think it saves you a lot of time and you get to see the underlying structure of different things. So I really love open source. So I'm glad that there is a place that has awesome CDK projects. And finally, the big thing, the Go version of the CDK, which is exciting because I'm actually a Gopher myself. So when this came up, I was super excited to want to try this, and I started leveraging it, and I really enjoy using this version of the CDK language library. So I know it's been a long day, but we've got a final request here, right? So our final request is coming from Mary. So this is from the backend team. So they need a deployment pipeline and an Angular for the Angular monitoring dashboard. And she wants to know if we can create this in CDK and create some constructs. And as you can see, our requests are getting, they want us to create this faster and faster, right? We went from 2 weeks to 2 days to 2 hours now. So sorry for the rush. So let's quickly take a look at how we can do that. Well, what we can do is we cannot recreate the wheel again. We can actually leverage both modules and CDK to create this solution and get this out as quickly as possible so we can look like a hero. So let's quickly take a look at what that looks like. All right. So again, just to recap, we have our modules. And this time, I'm actually going to go to the module section so you guys can actually see them. So we have the modules. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to leverage these modules within a CDK project. And we're going to use them just like we would any AWS resource. So let's quickly take a look at what that project looks like. So I have here is a CDK project. This is your typical CDK project. As you can see, it's a typical CDK project. And if you're not familiar with the layout of this project, it's okay. Basically, this is what's generated when you run the CDK init command. It generates this all this kind of scaffolding for you. But the most important part about this is this lib folder. And what this does is this lays out what your stack looks like, right? So if you're familiar with the CDK, you've kind of seen this a little bit. So basically, your typical CDK layout. And as you can see, the special part about this is we're actually leveraging modules inside this CDK project. So again, we didn't have to recreate the wheel to get this project done. We can create a construct with modules inside them, and we can give it to that team, and we can look like heroes when we do this. So you can actually leverage this. And why is this so? Because up under the hood, the CDK is just going to generate a CloudFormation template for us, right? So let's quickly take a look at what that looks like. So if we're in our CDK project, let's load that up. Okay. So we've got a CDK project here, and we have CDK installed, apparently. So let's go here, CDK. And if we run the command, CDK synth, What does that do? Well, basically, it synthesizes this template, and we get this thing that looks like a CloudFormation template, right? Right? So basically, the synth command just spits it out like a CloudFormation template. Simple enough, right? But what's cool about it is, if you notice that this template looks very similar to the one that we created by hand, right? It's got our modules as 2 different properties there. Of course, there's a couple different things in this template to manage the template that the CDK uses. But at the core, you can see it's leveraging modules, just like we did when we hard-coded these modules in a template. So we're actually able to leverage the CDK to create this for us, right? So if we have our modules, we have our modules within our project, we can just run CDK deploy, and we can test out our solution. Oh, sorry. Okay, so the CDK is going to go through here, and it's going to deploy this infrastructure for us. It's going to create a change set. It's going to leverage our modules that we had in the registry. So it takes a little bit of a second. It creates a change set, and if we're quick enough, we can actually jump over to the console, and we can actually see this stack being deployed right before our eyes. So as you can see, the CDK is doing something that's very similar to what we did. If we go here and we look at our template again, we can actually see that we're leveraging those modules within our template, and we're using those modules that we created earlier in order to create this project, right? So the CDK is going through, it's breaking out these resources. We're getting the same resources that we had in our combined stack. So at this point, what we've done is we've leveraged the CDK to reuse these modules. So that's pretty much how you can tie in the CDK and the modules together. You can just use those within them. And again, if we go to our public registry, you can actually leverage those modules out of the public registry. So for instance, if we wanted to leverage the JFrog Linux Bastion module, basically we can put that in our CDK project. We can put that in our CloudFormation template. We can leverage what's already created without reinventing the wheel. And another thing about these modules is they are versioned. So if you submit a new version of your module, well, you get a default version, and you get several different versions of it. So you can actually change the version. So as you can see, we submitted this a number of times. So I have 4 different versions for each one of them. And you can iterate on these modules over and over again. And that way, people don't have to change their templates. They can just leverage the module over and over again. So that's pretty much it on how you can leverage modules and CDK together. So we'll go back to the slides. And I want to thank you guys for coming out. I know it's late. Thank you for coming to this 5:30 presentation and on a Monday, on the first day of reInvent. And I'm super excited to see you guys' faces. If you see me on the boulevard or around, please come and say hi, because I'm a very friendly guy. And thank you so much for this presentation. Oh, and don't forget to complete the survey. All five people, please, if you want to see me back again, please.